Hello there guys, it's Joey. So today I am talking about the goddess Morrigan and her totem animal, the eel, the warrior eel. And I'm going to try not to crack up every time I say eel because it just feels so good. Go on, try it with me, say eel. I know, shut up, get on with it. Right. So I really wanted to do this video for a little while actually. And I've kind of mentioned the eel in passing, and I really wanted to do this video and talk about some concepts behind the symbolism of the animal totem eel with regards to the goddess Morrigan. And I think it's perhaps one of the most under-examined, underutilized totems associated with her shapeshifting that there is. A lot of people will come to me and say, you know, I see crows a lot. Could it be the goddess Morrigan? I don't think I've had one person talk to me about eel imagery. I'm pretty sure I've never had anybody ask me about eel imagery. Some people ask me about water imagery, you know, river imagery, which will come into this, and they kind of intertwine with eel imagery. And before we get into the sort of meat, I don't know why meat needs that, but there you go. The meat of the video, because it's a warrior video. I'm going to mention actually that eels is something that I have seen. Over in the neighbouring town, there is a statue of an eel. Yep. I don't think I've seen a statue of an eel anywhere in my life, up until the point where I'm in a place and I'm in open worship of the goddess Morrigan and there's an eel statue. Yep. So I think eels are fascinating. They're not something that you really hear a lot about. They're not the pretty totem perhaps that some of the others are. You know, people can get behind wolves, people can get behind crows and ravens, people can get behind heifers and cows even, and there are a few other bits and pieces here and there, and there are totems that come to us that we believe, that we feel in our heart of hearts that these come to be associated with our path walking, to do with Morrigan, even if they're not in the myth. And the moth, in terms of the crone aspect of the goddess Morrigan, in her aspect of babe, or just in her crone aspect if you prefer, that is definitely something that speaks to me, and I have a video about that already. So, why eels? Well, like I said, it's something that I have been meaning to really talk about and cover for a little while now. And the eel imagery comes up in the... I have all my pronunciations written down because I inevitably screw the pronunciations up, right? In the stories to do with Cuchulainn. And Cuchulainn is the Morrigan's most favoured warrior. And I think it's very interesting when we start looking into the symbolism and the imagery to do with this particular story, which is in the Ulster cycle story. Toin Boko Lanyun. I have no idea if I pronounced that right or hashed that. I probably hashed it. So, if you aren't aware of the particular story in which the goddess Morrigan visits her most favourite warrior, Cuchulainn, and attacks him in the form of 3 animals, then here we go, in a very shortened and very, probably a lot less stylized and interesting manner. So, the goddess Morrigan visits her favourite warrior on the eve of battle as a very young, beautiful woman, and offers herself to him in terms of sexual favours. And anybody who is offered and accepts sexual favours from the goddess Morrigan is blessed following it. It's an exchange of sort of sexuality and coming together with one's goddess, which we will discuss at length in a bit when we talk about the story. However, Cuchulainn he rejects the Morrigan, and depending on where you're reading it and how it's put forth, he doesn't reject her very nicely. He basically, you know, I didn't come here for a woman's arse is basically the the long and short of it. So in response to this, not very pleased with being sexually rejected, she threatens to attack him mid-battle in the form of an eel, a she-wolf, and a heifer, a cow. And he counter-threatens the goddess Morrigan that he will break her ribs, eye, and leg in response to this. If she attacks him in the form of these three animals, then he will attack her in kind and break her ribs, eye, and leg. So some people take this story to be indicative of the goddess Morrigan's spite. And some people take it to mean pretty much at face value that you just don't irritate the goddess Morrigan. You don't reject her offerings of help. However, I've come to feel completely differently about this story, and some of it is portrayed very, very well in Morpheus Raviana's book of the Great Queen, and she talks about a symbolic, ritualistic act of, it's sort of almost like a dance between god and goddess, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. In eel form, the action that she takes against Cuchulainn is to draw a noose around his feet and pull him on his back. She trips him, like pull a noose around his feet and trip him over, knock him over. He gets up. And And here there is correlation between the idea of an eel and magical workings, particularly binding magic and cursing. There's the correlation between eels and rivers, as a lot of these eels are said to live in rivers, and rivers and the goddess Morrigan are inextricably linked. She turns up many times. There's many examples of rivers being important to her. There's, you know, the rivers going into the cave being entrances to the other world, and there is other examples in lore, such as straddling the river after she straddled Dagda. There's a lot of sexual imagery involved in the goddess Morrigan, as you may have noticed. And for anybody who has watched Memoirs of a Geisha, I think it's very easy to say that the eel has a very definite sexual connotation, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in later. But if you haven't seen Memoirs of the Geisha, they talk about a man's eel visiting a woman's cave. And this imagery kind of works within the context of the goddess Morrigan's imagery, because not only is a cave associated with female genitalia in this instance, in this example, but it's also an entrance to the other world. So there is your correlation between sexuality and death, which comes up with the goddess Morrigan. So a quote that I found really interesting, actually, from Morgana Raviana's The Great Queen, is the eel appears in the symbolism and language of sorcery, in particular cursing and binding practice. Possibly related, serpents are loosely associated with the Morrigan's son, Meku. It looks like it's mesh, but it's pronounced Meku, who has 3 hearts with 3 serpents in them. He is a monstrous son of the goddess Morrigan. He, you know, if he's allowed to live, there's going to be like death across the land, and he is murdered by the hero Magick, who kills him, burns his hearts, scatters the ashes in rivers. So we go back to the rivers again through the son of the Morrigan, who has serpents in his heart. So there is a correlation here between eel and serpent, which may well be interchangeable. And where is the bit where Morpheus Raviana talks about the etymology of the word of eel? Aha, right. Bernard Mies notes that the word for eel, ison, may in fact be related to the word iskein, meaning to curse, and niskade, binding. And so, also in the myth Os, don't mind me and my notes. She draws similarities to the druid Mugrud, who conjures an eel in a stream, which binds and constricts his enemy in the siege of Nochlong. The binding spell weaves together the binding coils of an eel's body and its fiery and watery surfaces. In that mythos, the eel is also referred to as a serpent and a dragon. And I felt that that may correspond to energies of Ouroboros here. So in that myth, which is separate from Morrigan myth, but it is drawing sort of parallels across Celtic myth, the druid summons a serpent who goes on a monstrous rampage from a river, and it's a serpent of fire and water, and a she eel, we should say as well, a female entity, and it's very much about the magic of binding and cursing, and it's very much drawn from the water. So we have these ideas that the eel is related to energies of cursing and binding magic, and the goddess Morrigan is well known for being a sorceress, and she's even referred to as the sorceress of Tuatha De Danann. I can't pronounce it. And she has a rich history, particularly in battle, of conjuring up feats of magic in order to assist whatever the battle is going on. So there is this imagery here with the association of the eel to do with magic, to do with binding, to do with summoning, both in terms of water and the conjuration of, particularly of seemingly malignant forces, seemingly constrictive and binding and attaching and tightening of these magics in the form of an animal totem. So within terms of why an eel for teaching Cuchulainn a lesson, or the suggested interaction between the sort of ritualistic combat, the dance, if you like, between goddess and chosen warrior. Well, the first way in which she binds him is by an eel, and perhaps this can be seen as symbolic of a lesson of magic, because the other lessons could be lessons of other things. You could associate wolf with perhaps ferocity, and you can associate the heifer, the cow, with sovereignty. So these could be three different lessons to do with virtues, basically, virtues of a warrior, and making him to be the best version of himself that he can be, and the inextricable nature in which her warrior and her are bound. And therefore the first animal totem in which we are shown the goddess Morrigan in is the one that's to do with binding, and that could almost be a ritual magical act within itself, that the first animal is the one that binds, it's the one that's binding the lesson. And this forms a noose around his feet as he's fighting in battle the warrior Loch. And it's a big, ferocious battle. It's a difficult battle for Cuchulainn. And she's hindering him, seemingly, to test him on all of his levels of being a warrior. Now, for me, it feels very much like this lesson of binding, this lesson of magic, this lesson of sure-footedness to do with keeping one grounded in the mundane realm as well as the magical realm. It's about the prowess of a warrior that goes beyond the human. Cuchulainn is considered to be half god, and so he should have a magical prowess, a magical awareness, and that's what the eel forming the noose around the feet is very much about. When the battle takes place, the Morrigan is known to be prophetic, and often her spell work comes through prophecy and the spoken word. And as we have talked about before, Celtic magic and this oral nature of Celtic myth and magic means that the word is inextricably linked to magic. And her prophecy that she will do these things to him, she pre-warns him, he knows it's coming, comes true. So her word as a goddess is unparalleled. It's truth, and it cannot be avoided. It's prophecy. It's the realm of the sorcerer, the realm of magic, the realm. Now, the other two animals tie in as well, of course, and I'm not going to go into huge depth here because we're going to focus on the eel part of the myth, the totem. So there are two versions of the Cuchulainn story, and in the Book of Leinster version, he was magically bound by the women of his tribe to destroy the Morrigan. They put like a guise on him, like a magic through the spoken word. Now, this is also important because in the mythos, he swears not to heal the goddess Morrigan, and she says that I believe she tells him that he will heal her, and he like swears that he will not, and so he tries to basically make his word the truth of the situation, and in the end the goddess Morrigan, who is a full-blown goddess, as word is the truth of the situation. Her prophecy outweighs his, if you like, because and it's kind of like putting her sovereignty back in place. So there is an element of, you are my warrior, you will fall into line and you will not give into this hubris, and that is a lesson within this particular mythos. So when he's fighting Locke, he is wounded 3 times by these 3 animals, and he strikes back at her. So there is a parallel between both of the things that they said do come true. She says she will wound him as this animal, this animal, and this animal, and he says he will break this, this, and this. And when the eel coils around his feet and throws him on his back, he rises up again and deals a blow to break the ribs. And I think that's very indicative of the relationship here between eel and ribs. If you think about the pain of broken ribs, it hurts. And the ribs are very much about the keeping of one's insides on the inside. They are the center of the body. They keep everything protected on the inside. There's an element of keeping everything together, keeping everything in place, keeping everything grounded. I already talked about the fact that the eel as a magical totem could be symbolic of the magic, keeping that grounded in reality, keeping one's footing. And in retaliation for her removing his grounding, like tripping him up, he breaks her ribs, and which is to do with, keeping your insides protected. And you can draw parallels here between the eel being a creature of water and sort of our internal workings, blood work, basically. The rivers of one's body are bloodlines, veins, and the eel is an animal which, in this mythos, is swimming through the water, across the rivers, and therefore the rivers of blood can be tied into that mythos through sort of breaking of the ribs and keeping everything protected. this happens with each time that he wounds her as she wounds him. And therefore the parallel between the relationship, the ritual, the dance between god and warrior is shown to, so they sort of mirror one another, so that when he is wounded, she is wounded. And that goes to show something beyond this mere interpretation of simple spite and retaliation, that there is a wounding of each other, that they are inextricably linked in a spiritual way. Following this fight, he's pretty undone. Like, his prowess has been pushed to the limits. He is feeling exhausted and demoralized, and then we have a counterbalanced ritual exchange of healing here. So the Morrigan then shows up in the form of an old hag milking a cow. Now, bearing in mind, of course, that the heifer is the last, the conclusion, the sovereignty element to the three attacks that I talked about. And she turns up as an old hag. Now, bear in mind, she starts off the story as this beautiful young woman presenting herself for sexual favours that he rejects. And the whole thing ends pretty much with her as a hag offering him milk. Now, you can take from this what you will. Is this the completion of her cycle in terms of her sexual nature? Is this going from young maid to old hag? And is there an element of the feminine arc in terms of life cycle there? I think so. And there is this sort of milk imagery that's quite interesting. You know, she milks from the teat of a cow. So we've gone from I can't think of any other way to say it. You know, the idea of a young perky lady with perky bosoms and wanting to be impregnated possibly and lactating on her own, to sort of the old hag image that is past that point and then milks a cow and offers the milk to the hero. He accepts that and is restored by 3, and 3 being the magic number in Celtic mythos, life, death and rebirth, the cycles. And he takes the milk each time and is healed by it, and he blesses the old hag each time he drinks a glass of milk. Drink milk, kids. And he blesses her, and the blessing heals the damage that he has done. So he said he would never heal her, and then he blesses her, and his word is not the be-all and end-all, because the goddess's word is the be-all and end-all, and his blessing means that his words, once spoken, the all-powerful oral tradition of magic, which ties back to the idea of the eel, heals her. In one version, he is kind of spiteful on the end of this. In another version, that doesn't take place. So it's depending on how you feel about that exchange. However, it's worth noting here as well, of course, of the okay, camera, calm down. I know I looked down at my notes. Camera was like, no magic for you. Right, okay. So the magical nature of the exchange, that's all very much tied into the idea of magic. And shape-shifting is what I associate with the goddess Morrigan more than anything. I think shape-shifting is what I would summarize her as a goddess of if I had to pick one thing, which I would never do, but if I had to, that's what I would sort of define her energies as, constantly shape-shifting. And that's a magical art, that's a sorceress art, that is providing an animal that speaks to elements of herself. And because of the interchange here between her and her warrior Cuchulainn, it's very much in my mind that the 3 animals are very sort of indicative of him as well as of her, because she chose these 3 animals for a reason. And I've already expressed how I feel the eel ties into the idea of magic and tripping him up and keeping him grounded, and the godly prowess and the interchangeability of wounding, and that being a mirror reflection of one another, and sort of like the magic link there between her and her chosen warrior. It's like the life force flows between them, the rivers converge. And I feel it can be indicative in another way as well. I think there's a strong sexual undertone here, which I mentioned already. And I think there is also a life-death imagery. But we'll go with the sexual imagery first. That I wrote all my own notes down. Isn't it wonderful? All these notes you're getting. It's been a while since I wrote a load of notes for a video. Right. The sexuality of the encounter is what strikes me when I really look at it, because it starts off being a sexual advance, which he rejects, and then the combat unfurls around it, and the cycle, which we've already talked about. So the eel is the first animal. I've already talked about the fact that I feel that the eel is symbolic of the male sexual organ. And it kind of strikes me as really symbolic of the fact the first animal that she attacks him is an eel. It's like, you rejected me with your eel, so yoink, and he ends up flat on his back in a very open position to be straddled. And that can, you know, it kind of feels to me a little bit like, well, if you rejected the Morrigan sexual advances, which would have been a fun straddling, here, have the possibility of being straddled by a warrior and belted to death. So there is kind of this almost dark humour to it. It's kind of a little bit worrisome, but it's kind of like a naughty lesson in terms of the Morrigan. I can feel that kind of coming through in that lesson. I can feel that sort of, you know, well, if you'd have accepted and seen the aid for what it was without having to learn the hard way, then it would have been a much more pleasurable experience, such as the Dagda, who, you know, accepted her sexual favours and had a jolly good time and then won his battle. Then that would have been far better for you, but we're going to do this the hard way and you're going to learn the lesson. And then that ritual exchange takes place, and going on and going forth. And you could argue there's a little bit of something sexual in sort of the ingestion of milk at the end. I've already talked about the fact that she goes from youthful to old hag, and it kind of misses the middle step because he didn't engage with her, and the middle step becomes much more of like the warrior rather than the mother aspect, which is an interesting parallel. And what really spoke to me on this, I was kind of having a look at tarot imagery to do with sexuality and eels. And there don't tend to be many eels in terms of imagery within decks. There is like the Druid Animal deck, and there is an eel in that. I don't have that one. But the one I did really feel for was from the Mary L, which is the Three of Wands. Right, so this is the image. And this to me speaks of warlike energies completely. You have obviously the colour associations here with the goddess Morrigan being very red, very bloody, and black, obviously. Now, we've talked about rivers of blood. We talked about, you know, the lifelines of water and rivers being interchangeable with what human bodies, rivers, which is human blood. And you have the crossed staves here. One could almost make an argument for this being sort of a magical looking stave, and this being a very warlike physical looking stave. The crossing over of magic versus physical combat, which kind of ties into the Cuchulainn myth quite well. Her magic versus his brute strength. And then you have the sort of serpent, which looks very eel-like, I feel, to the eye here, and the association of Kundalini energy. And the Kundalini is often is the sexual energy often portrayed as a serpent which coils at the base of the spine, and is to do with sex and knowledge being intertwined. And I'm going to read to you the description from the Mary L book. because I think it ties in with this quite well. And if we sort of interchange eel and serpent in this case, which we can call back on that myth of the druid whose name I'm going to have to turn the page over to pronounce, Mugrud, as he summoned an eel, and that was called an eel, a dragon, and a serpent interchangeably. So from the Mary L, sex and knowledge between the two trees, two people, two aspects of self or heaven and earth. So between warrior and Morrigan. The merging of male and female sets the Kundalini in motion, pushing up through the spine, creating the third pillar through which the lightning of God in this case, or goddess in our case, can blast down and through, in which our consciousness can travel up. Intent and desire, lust for knowledge and enlightenment are the base of the pillar of mildness. From here mankind looks up and reaches up towards the heavens, reaches for the answers to the great mysteries of good and evil and life and death. So here we have the idea of the serpent and this sort of clashing of selves, the clashing of earth and magic, and the serpent rising from a Kundalini image that talks about intent and desire, lust, knowledge and enlightenment. So it is the interweaving of sexuality with knowledge, with searching for purpose. It's not simply base desire, but the merging of sexuality and soul, which is what the goddess Morrigan was truly offering in her sexual advances. And so that's how I felt this mythos really came through. Eels obviously have the sexual connotation, and yeah. So I feel that the eel totem comes forth at the head of this myth. So many double entendres in that sentence. You enjoy that, people? It's terrible. And I really feel that this was very much about the intermingling of energies between God, half God, and goddess, and warrior and war goddess, and teacher and student, and the intermingling of their energies. And she wounds him and he wounds her, and there is a physical interplay that takes place instead of the sexual encounter place, but it kind of parallels up to this sort of sexual connotation. And so the first thing is that eel, is that tripping up, that flat on the back, that magic that takes place at the start. And while we talk about rivers and eels and magic, I think it's really important to look at river mythos, particularly with regards to the goddess Morrigan, whom we mentioned. You know, rivers come up a lot. They come up with her son, they come up with her, and eels swim along rivers in these mythoses, and rivers are dividers, and they divide land in terms of physical location, but they also divide the life and death in terms of symbolic imagery, I suppose. They separate worlds, they are dividers, and the Morrigan of course transverses life and death and rebirth. And I think you can pull a little bit more on this serpent imagery here with the idea of Ouroboros, which, as it happens, is on the back of the card of the Mary L. So the Ouroboros is usually a snake or a serpent, but sometimes also a dragon devouring its own tail. And bearing in mind, if we go back to the Druid myth, that eel was described as a dragon and as a serpent. So it's not a million miles away to find the interchangeability, or at least follow the river a little bit to Ouroboros. And so the idea behind Ouroboros is it's a very ancient symbol. of a serpent devouring its own tail, and it's about the cyclic nature of the universe. Creation from destruction, life from death, an eternal cycle of renewal. And I really feel that Eel goes back to this magic, goes back to this symbolism of creation from destruction, life from death, and eternal renewal. And that's present in the Morrigan myth to do with Cuchulainn as well, because creation from destruction, she wounds him to make him the best version of himself, to test him, to make him find his prowess, to make him a better warrior. But it's also life from death. They're both feeling depleted, they're both wounded, and they heal one another through this sort of connection, this cyclic nature between warrior and goddess. They are to do with each other so much that the renewal aspect is tied in. These cycles of life, death, and rebirth that you can take from these myths. And you can even take them from how the Morrigan appears at each point as being, maiden, mother, and crone, if you wish to go down that cycle, or just, maiden and hag, two ends of the spectrum. And then the shape-shifting in between is the cyclic nature of magic and of the Celtic mythos and warrior cycle, and life and death between goddess and warrior here. I really enjoy the idea of being a dance between them, and it showing and showcasing the important aspects of what she's trying to teach him and what therefore that eel comes to represent. It's very much in my mind tied to this sexuality and this sort of sexual cycle that goes on between them, and this kundalini energy, this rising of awareness, and he becomes more aware of who the goddess Morrigan is nearly at the end of all his myths. He realizes who she is, usually too late. But the idea of the kundalini imagery going into this myth is sort of like the rising of the sexuality of Cuchulainn, she tries to awaken his sexuality in the beginning, and his resistance and his rejection and his putting blocks in the way basically blocks himself. It basically stops him from reaching his prowess and awakening and realizing the connection to the goddess Morrigan, this enlightenment that comes from the interweaving of sexuality and soul, which I think is really important within understanding Morrigan mythos. And the rising of the kundalini energy, very serpent-like, is kind of indicative of what is happening in that shape-shifting. It starts with the eel making a noose, binding his feet, his very, very bottom base of his feet in terms of, physicality, and he is toppled that very first minute of awakening, and bang, and is down on his back. So yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. We talked about them being associated with myth and magic and depth, and definitely I think you can make arguments for like the cyclic natures of magic as well, like through Ouroboros, of course, like I mentioned, but also there's this death element, and often water and rivers were associated with being, like I said, boundaries to the other world. And swords in rivers, which is why Arthurian myth is believed by some to derive from Celtic mythos. Offerings were thrown into rivers and bodies of water because they were believed to cross over into the realm of the gods through basically a conduit to spirit. And weapons and things to do with war, as well as other things, were considered to be gifts of honour to the gods and were placed in water. And so rivers in particular here associated with Morrigan. So having the eel as a water shape-shifting, and if you even think about, like the movement of eels through water and that sort of cyclic motion, that very physical cyclic representation through physical motion, it's also kind of sexy if you think about moving your hips. dear. Right, okay, and it has all those associations in there with eel, you know. You can find that sort of sexual awakening, that magic and sexuality, that magic and soul and sexuality all into one, intermingling into one energy. And I think that's very, very important when examining the goddess Morrigan. And it gets so overlooked, the eel, that I really wanted to focus on it and talk about it. And I think the idea of her being spiteful and the idea of this sexuality being a negative connotation thing here, and in general to do with female mythos and power, needs to be really re-examined. Like there's more going on to this myth than, you know, she got sexually rejected so she was knocked off at him and retaliated. You know, there is a lesson here, there is a growth process, there is this interchangeability of energies, of interactions between goddess and her warrior, and the reflection on one another of how they wound one another is not simply one way, is really wonderful, because it just shows the interconnectivity between chosen warrior and goddess. And I think it's beautiful. I think there's a lot to be gleaned from working with eel imagery, really examining what that means and looking at rivers as boundaries crossing over, and the nature of magic, of course, in Celtic mythos, and the goddess Morrigan, who acts through spellwork a lot of the time, crosses over into the realm of the spirit, crosses over into the realm of the other world. There is a connection between the other world and magic in Celtic mythos, as there is today, you know, people communicating with spirits, animal spirits, plant spirits, and of course human spirits. So there is an element of that, you know, ancestry and connection with spirits and connection with the other world that comes into eel magic because of the connection to rivers, and the rivers being borders between our world and the other world. So I think that will do. I think I've rambled and made enough innuendos for one video. Yes. Right, so I hope you enjoyed this video about eels. If you have any, and the goddess Morrigan, obviously, and Cuchulainn, bless him. So if you have any questions or any further thoughts, please pop them down below. And this is it for this video, and I must start working my way through other requested videos. I promise. I'm looking at it. I promise. Many blessings.